friends. In April 1919, 100 April, I say not May, 100 years before today, it became clear to Chinese intellectuals that the Versailles Peace Conference, which drew up the treaty that officially ended World War I, took a decision to transfer the former German concessions in Shandong to Japan. And there were other humiliations that China suffered. Some days later, on May 4th, 1919, thousands of students from 13 colleges in Beijing went out to demonstrate. And the rest, as we know, is history. 100 years have passed, and they have not passed quietly. But here we are all gathered here in this room at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to share our thoughts, impressions, ideas of the May 4th and its aftermath. May 4th movement revisited. Well, I'm glad to open our symposium in which we have assembled here the finest world scholars in the field that can shed light on different aspects of the issue. This symposium was supported by the Hebrew University, by the Center of Literary Studies, by the Freeburg Center for East Asian Studies, and by the Confucius Institute at the Hebrew University. I thank them all. Now, our first greeter was supposed to be the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. He will show up later, and we will start with greetings by Professor Wang Shizhou, my colleague in directing the Confucius Institute. Professor Wang is a professor of law at the Peking University, and Peking University is very important. It all started there. So please, Professor Wang.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And then I express my sincere good morning to Professor Ebb. Thank you, Professor Dr. Li, my dear colleagues. It's a great honor for me to say some word to greeting the opening of this conference. I'm very happy that we have a chance to open this conference and then to express to do our revisit to this May 4th movement. May 4th movement is of great significance in Chinese modern history, at least in two senses. One is politically, the second one is culturally. And in politically, a lot of research has been done and quite complete. But the culture, in the cultural sense, it is, may I say so, because I'm not an expert in this area, just the beginning. But the Venerance movement as a symbol, it will reclaim the Chinese linguistic to form the new Chinese modern language. And then now we are thinking about the new significance of this direction upon the new development in China. So I'm, of course, in my country, my university, Peking University, is very important and very positive in this May 4th movement. And then we are very happy about that. So both, in both sense, in the political sense and in cultural sense. And then as the counterpart of the Confucius Institute with Hebrew University in Israel. So Peking University will continue to be positive and influential in supporting this cultural exchange and cooperation. We are very happy that this is a beginning of new expansion of our academic exchange and cooperation. Yeah, so we are very happy that Professor Ouyang Zesheng is invited to be in this conference. And Ouyang Zesheng is the leading scholars in this field. And in the future, our Confucius Institute in Huji will continue and will try our best to do as more as we can to expand this cultural academic exchange and cooperation between Peking University and Hebrew University. And then by this way, we hope that we can increase and to have a better mutual understanding and mutual cooperation in the future. I wish this conference a good success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. And now we really start. Our first speaker is Professor Wolfgang Kubin. Professor Kubin from Bonn University and in recent years from Beijing Foreign Studies University. Well, Professor Kubin is a very well-known sinologist in all the world. He's a poet in German and a writer in Chinese and in German and a translator of contemporary Chinese literature from Chinese to German. He published numerous poetry books, essays books, and translations. Among other publications is his book, The History of Chinese Literature in the 20th Century in German. Today, he will speak about rethinking May 4th through Lu Xun. And Lu Xun is an author that Professor Kubin really translated immensely. Thank you.
הוא היה חבר טוב מאוד של הגברת איבר, הוא כל הזמן במשך 20 שנה, הוא כל הזמן שלח לה דברים, אולי הוא יגיד מילה, אפשר להגיד לו.
Dear friends, thanks again that I have the possibility, probably for the third time, to be together with you. I am a little bit weak. I could not sleep for 2 days. I hope my deliberations weren't too chaotic. What I present here is a paper written for a conference in Vienna 2 years ago. I could not attend. I have never given this paper. It's in German, and I try to summarize the most important aspects. The first is, how do we understand Lu Xun? Only from history or also from today? The next topic is, how do we understand a text? Third is, what is good literature? The fourth is mass and power and the problem of pity. The fifth is utopia and violence. And finally, I will end up, if the time allows, with the idea of doubt as an important part of modernity, just as well as memory. The paper was then called The Stony Guest, Lu Xun and Modernity. The idea of a stony guest possibly comes from Nietzsche. Possibly it means that on our desk there is someone watching us and asking us, what are you going to do? Anyhow, some years ago at Beijing Foreign Studies University, I was given Lu Xun in the form of a statue or sculpture in iron. And what I saw was just what I was told during Culture Revolution when I learned Chinese for 1 year at Beiyou, Foreign Language Institute. What I was given was sculptured in the form of Soviet art. Lu Xun is a hero. But after our 89, we had to rethink our I'm always talking in Chinese, our understanding of China. And I gave a paper about Lu Xun some years ago, and we had a very good and rich discussion in Hong Kong, where everyone did not agree to my idea. We should understand Lu Xun only from history, from the past, and not try through him our presence. But this means that Lu Xun is a dead man. Actually, Lu Xun already turned from a hero to a stranger in China. His quotations are a matter of the censorship. What you read when quoted in books by Chinese colleagues, you have to be cautious. Might be it's not original Lu Xun. Lu Xun is a dangerous man. How do we understand Lu Xun? As a hero? As a stranger? Well, understanding nowadays is part of contemporary German philosophy. Understanding is very difficult. There cannot be only one Lu Xun. There must be many Lu Xuns, because any text that we read is not a fixed text with one meaning only, but an open text with many different meanings. So in German, we have a new quotation from a GDR author. A text is much more intelligent than the author. Much more. So in the text is always something that the author does not see or did not see. Some decades ago, we had a big quarrel in the so-called West between the French Michel Lois and the Australian, I think so, Simon Leys. Michel Lois was of the opinion that we can understand Lu Xun only from revolution. But what kind of revolution did she have in mind? And Simon Leys saw much more in Lu Xun. He saw very clearly for the first time in the so-called West that Lu Xun was suffering from melancholy not only, but also from depression. But this way, seeing it this way, would mean that we have two Lu Xuns, the revolutionary and the melancholic. But there are many more Lu Xuns. This has to do with modernity, which from a certain aspect started with May 4th movement. Be it as it were, understanding is not a result but a process. So actually we have to be aware that there are many different Lu Xuns and that sometimes we can understand him only from the outside and not from the inside. I will give some examples for this. When I had the chance for the last time to talk with a Viennese sinologue, Richard Trappel, die ich hatte, über Kong-Iji, he made a very important remark. The most important thing of Kong Iji, the great narrative. Kong Iji is a person and is the name of a narrative. The most important thing of this narrative is the last sentence. But how do we interpret the last sentence? And here will start all our problems. The last sentence can be translated into perhaps he, this is Kong Iji, is dead. And Richard Trappel said something very important. He said the most important word in Kong Iji is perhaps. And this means that we have to pay attention to a lot of tiny things if we want to understand another Lucian. I wrote about Lucian's narratives some years ago, a paper which was written in English and translated into Chinese. And it might be possible that the idea I tried to present also comes from Richard Trappel. My paper was called The Unfinished Text, or Literature as Palimpsest. This means that Lucian must not for sure be aware of what he was writing. And we cannot ask him, what does this Yeshu, this perhaps mean? So we as a reader have to finish this text because it is an open text, open to any kind of interpretation. Richard Trappel was of the opinion, Yeshu perhaps means that there's no answer. And I think he is right. We cannot know anything for sure. We are on the road. We try to understand. This means that any good modern literature is ambivalent. There's no objective reality. There's only our subjective realities. The most intriguing problem of Kong Iji is who is the speaker? It's not clear. It's totally unclear. First we have a child, then we have an adult. But the last sentence is who is the last sentence speaking? Modern literature does not know any more common sense. There's no, as we say in Latin, communis opinio. There are many different meanings, opinions, and we have to be open for this. It was the Viennese Professor Weigelin Schwürzig who 30 years ago provoked a discussion because she thought we can only understand Lucian from Nietzsche. And I paid attention to the fact that one word is repeated in the writings of Lucian all the time, Wuliao. It's boring. So for him, May 4th movement was boring. And Wuliao also means melancholic. So modernity is just what we now discover. Modernity takes us into melancholy and depression, and we cannot get out of it. But Nietzsche was of the opinion we have to live in a very dangerous way. And Lucian was living in a very dangerous way. Nietzsche was a big destroyer. He was very dangerous, just as Lucian is. He is not the great holy man anymore as whom he was praised by Mao Zedong. He is not read on the mainland anymore. And he was taken out of the school books. Lucian is very dangerous. And this is the reason why now censorship does not stop before him. In some respect, we can say that Lu Xun had to face, in our eyes, a downfall. But this is what makes him great. He is not a representative of May 4th at all. He always was critical of the young men and women who were full of dreams but did not understand anything. Modernity is a dream which is not finished at all. And Lu Xun, perhaps for the first time in history, saw this very clearly. Well, what is good literature? What is modern literature? We can modern literature not understand anymore only from within. Chinese literature can not be understood anymore from within. And German literature, modern, cannot be understood from within anymore too. Without Nietzsche, there's no Lu Xun. And this was one of the reasons why, in our aftermath of 1968, the most famous writers, both in East and West, just as Enzensberger, Buch, Hein, that they started their own work sometimes with Lu Xun, making use of his ideas, thinking about or rethinking revolution. I now come to the problem of mass and power. Lu Xun perhaps was the first writer in the world, perhaps we have to think about it, who had a clear feeling for the mass, who wanted to see how people are whipped, beaten up, or executed. We have similar things in America or in other countries. But Elias Canetti, who got the Nobel Prize in 1981, might be the first who had an idea of mass and power. This book, Mass and Power, was published by him in German in the 60s, and it was reprinted in Germany already for more than 60 times. He makes a difference between the mass and the mob. What the mass is, this is what we have experienced in German history, in Chinese history. There's no need to go on. But what we have to consider more, perhaps, is the mob. Because Canetti says the mob is lying in wait for its victim. Something like that we can see in Kong Yizi or in the story of Akio. But since when does the problem of mass and mob start? Peter Sloterdijk, one of the most important German philosophers, said what we in German call Neuzeit, what might be in English modern times or in China, Jindai. The phenomenon of the mass starts with the French Revolution. Napoleon used the mass for conquering Europe. With a standing army, it was not possible. During the Cultural Revolution, we were always told, 不要脱离群众, you should not leave the masses. But the masses during Cultural Revolution were not the mob for sure. The mob are not many people, the mob might be some people. We have the problem of mass nowadays too. We have mass consumerism, we have mass media, and so on and so on. And we have a new term in our so-called Western history, fake news or rumor. Lu Xun perhaps was the first who was able to write a famous narrative about the rumor. That was his essay, his narrative called Fengbo. What Lu Xun fought again was that people betray themselves and they make use by lies to betray themselves. May 4th is a dream, the dream of a new human being. Nietzsche and Lu Xun, they thought about this in terms of Superman. The idea of Superman, if we see it from the histories of the last 200 years or so, always had to do with utopia and with violence. Nietzsche and Lu Xun have something in common we have to criticize. Nietzsche was again pity, and Lu Xun was again pity too. So he denied that we in our times could cherish fair play as Lin Yutang thought. Superman, as the philosopher Norbert Bolz recently says, it has always something to do with happiness. Now our problems start, because German philosophy always denies happiness as important for the development of mankind or as something for a single person. In our history, there have been people who tried to fulfill the dream of happiness in the United States, Robert Owen, for instance. But he was not successful. Now it is Xi Jinping who wants to carry the Chinese people into paradise, and he makes use of the words of happiness and paradise. If we see this problem from German philosophy, from Ernst Bloch, who wrote a book, The Principle of Hope, we find two strange phenomena. One is that, as Lu Xun said, hope, we hope for happiness, and desperation are two sides of the same coin. And if we read Ernst Bloch, Principle of Hope again, we will discover that his conception of hope, that means happiness too, had always to do something with violence, always. The search for happiness is the search for utopia. The search for utopia is the so-called fight against the bad. In German, we would say böse, evil. Against the evil. As my time runs out, I skip the problem of who is speaking. I will end within some minutes. So we come back to the question of modernity. What is modernity? Modernity is a dream. Modernity is not real. For Nietzsche, for Lu Xun, modernity means conflict. Modernity means doubt. We have to doubt ourselves all the time. But society does not allow us to doubt anything. If we doubt, then we discover that anything is open, including ourselves too. And what Lu Xun wrote about are the stigmata of modernity. We are lonely, we are depressive, and we kill each other all the time. This also has to do with that we are denied recollection, memory, and that we ask for forgetfulness. We have to forget, not to remember. Remember makes us weary. Lu Xun is a very complicated author who told us in his most famous first book that he did not pay attention to facts. He was inventing stories because he knew his readers could not bear his understanding of May 4th. Because he said, the new youth will nothing be else than the new slaves. And this was true till the end of the Cultural Revolution. The question is, how do we read texts? We have, in the case of May 4th, to read them from history, not from history. We can read them from history, but we have to read them more or less from the outside. When I was on the road to Jerusalem, I thought of May 4th, that May 4th invented the woman as a human being. If you pay attention to the classics, Ren does not mean translation problem. Ren means man, does not include woman, and so on and so on. But Ye Shentao, perhaps he was the first telling his readers that women are human beings. And that is a greatness on the other side of May 4th, and Dingling followed up in the 20s. Okay, my time is over. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Kubin. We have a lot to think of now. Well, our next speaker is Professor Ouyang Zhesheng. Professor Ouyang is a history professor at Peking University. He has published books and articles. Many of them deal with all sorts of Sino-Western encounters. His recent book deals with relations between Beijing and Western civilizations. Professor Ouyang's topic today is Hu Shi and Sino-Western cultural exchange during May 4th period. Please, Professor Ouyang.
把它变大。Dear Chair and everyone, good morning. I study Hu Shi for a long time. This paper is my new research mate. As the materials is very rich, so I just introduce briefly. Yeah, let's begin. As the capital of China, Beijing has played a major role in the exchange of culture between China and the West, and has taken critical position in Sino-Western relations. For quite some time, Beijing has maintained a significant population of Westerners. Most of them are diplomats, scholars, or tourists. Hu Shi was one of the rare handful of Chinese intellectuals who maintained a rather close relationship with this circle. This paper focused on Hu Shi's social interaction with the Westerners around 1917 to 1926, and how these interactions reflected the Sino-Western cultural exchange as a whole during the May 4th period. Part 1. Endless events. When compared with any previous period, Sino-Western cultural exchange in Beijing during the May 4th period seemed much more lively. Distinguished figures from the West arrived in Beijing one after the other. Meetings and discussions between Chinese and Western scholars were frequent, all of which culminated in an unprecedented peak of exchange between China and the West. Westerners who came to visit often and meetings with Hu Shi on the agenda. Hu Shi was kept busy touring with the material portion of his social diary taken up for these foreign affairs. This list of Western guests he met is surprised long. A peek into his agenda and diary would reveal that 1920 was his busiest year as far as foreign affairs are concerned. On February 25th and 27th, he met with Murphy, an American architect who was responsible for designing the Jilin Women's College, Yanjing University, and Tsinghua University. On May 20th, 1921, Hu Shi and Ding Wenjiang attended a dinner hosted by General Crozet at the Peking Hotel. Based on his subsequent reconnection, General Crozet graduated from West Point Military Academy in the U.S. and was served as an artillery commander during First World War. After returning, he and his wife returned to Beijing for a few months every year, and Hu Shi had become their good friend. On the evening of the 26th of June, Hu Shi and Meng He hosted a dinner at the garden for Professor James Quiner Dinner, the chairman of the American Sociology Association. Hu Shi and Ding Wenjiang held a farewell party for the Dewey family, Mr. Russell and Mr. Jorgen, on the evening of June 13. Hu Shi went to see Dewey off at the train station on July 11th. Dewey had been giving lectures in China for 2 years, many of which held in Beijing, with Hu Shi provided the interpretation. The Morning Post collected his lectures and published them as Dewey's 5 Great Lectures. This book was very popular during the May 4th period. On the evening of the September 10th, Hu Shi went to the train station to meet Mr. Paul Monroe, who was just arrived in Beijing. The next day, Hu Shi attended a welcoming function for Monroe at the Peking Hotel. Monroe was a renowned U.S. educationalist who taught at the Columbia University Teachers College. From mid-September to early October, a British-U.S. education expedition visited Beijing, and Hu Shi was the one to receive them when they first arrived. An American by the name of T.H. Powell Senior met with Hu Shi on October 21st. They talked for an hour and a half, during which Mr. Senior sought Hu Shi's opinion on the education system in China. In April, Hu Shi served as an interpreter for a man named Steven, who was visited Beijing as a representative of the U.S. New Bank Group. In the afternoon of April 15th, Hu Shi went to visit Mr. Margaret Sanger at the Peking Hotel. On April 19th, Ms. Sanger gave a talk on a famous book about marriage and the family in China at Peking University for a crowd of roughly 2,000 people, with Hu Shi served as her interpreter. On October 5th, Edwards led Hu Shi and Cai Yuanpei to meet with Seward Ed. Seward Ed was a renowned leader amongst the American Protestant missionaries. He was appointed the secretary in charge of Asia office by the International Committee. He spent 15 years in Asia. As Hu Shi was not in Beijing during 1923, there were almost no foreign affairs to speak of. There were hardly any foreign affairs in 1924 either. It's likely because tension caused by the North-South conflict resulted in a dramatic reduction of the number of Western visitors to China during this time. Hu Shi's diary reveals that most of the Western visitors coming to Beijing would be staying at the Peking Hotel or Liuguo Hotel. While they were in Beijing, they still preferred Western cuisine and rarely would they eat at Chinese restaurants. They hosted dinners either at the residence or in the hotels where they were staying. When Hu Shi met with them, he was usually responsible for interpreting and was undoubtedly the premier interpreter in Beijing at the time. He was the first choice interpreter for talks in English given by all important characters. Part 2. A frequent visitor to US and Europe embassy. To the right of Beijing's front gate was the Beijing Legation Quarter, which hosted the US and Europe embassies in a location called Dongjiao Minxiang. This area was not far from the location of Peking University. Apart from interacting with the higher-ranking government officials at Zhongnanhai, the former imperial guard diplomats from the embassies also inevitably mingled with those intellectuals who became fluent in foreign language after studying abroad. Hu Shi, who was socially adept and spoke perfect English, was often invited to the US and Europe embassies to attend all sorts of art activities, events, or banquets as a guest. As Hu Shi had studied in the US, he was naturally close with the US ambassador, his diary contains countless logs of his frequent visit to the US embassy. The first US ambassador Hu Shi had met was Crown, who was appointed by President Wilson to serve as the US ambassador to China. Crown was an experienced diplomat who was familiar with Chinese affairs, and Hu Shi wrote that he was very impressed by Crown's poise and extensive knowledge. Crown was succeeded by Mr. Schumann. Based on Hu Shi's diary on 11th May 1922, I went to meet with Mr. Schumann at around 10:13. Although he was the chancellor of my college, I didn't visit him often for fear of inviting suspicion. For the U.S. indemnity business, I went to talk with him for 1 hour. From 1913 to 1919, the U.S. ambassador to China was Mr. Renstraw. After his retirement, Renstraw continued to take part in various international conferences and activities, and Hu Shi often served as his interpreter. In September 1922, when he was in Beijing, Hu Shi got in contact with him. Hu Shi had previously promised him that he would write a book on Chinese ideas of peace, which was mentioned in his diary on September 17th. But this proposal never became a reality. Hu Shi was in very regular contact with Mr. Harding, the British counselor in Beijing. According to Hu Shi's diary, on July 3, 1921, Harding invited Hu Shi, Jiang Monglin, Tao Menghe, Ding Wenjiang, and Bevers and Mr. Powell to dinner. During this meeting, Hu Shi and Harding discussed the question of how China has regressed to its current state over its thousands years of history. Harding and Bever feared that China has not progressed since the Tang Dynasty, which was a fairly popular view in the West. Hu Shi and Ding Wenjiang argued that China has made many advances over the last 2,000 years. Hu Shi was also in contact with German diplomats. On the evening of May 3, 1922, Hu Shi went to the German embassy. Upholding that the new ambassador spoke English very well, the German counselor, Dr. Richard Wilhelm Weilixian, his Chinese name, was an expert in Chinese and a famous German sinologist. Dr. Weilixian went on to become the head of the University of Frankfurt's China Institute. At Weilixian's request, in 1926, Hu Shi delivered an English lecture on Chinese novels for the autumn session of the China Institute. In addition to this mentioned, Hu Shi also maintained good relations with people from Western church schools, cultural organizations, and news agencies in Beijing. His correspondence with these people mostly were about invitations to deliver lectures, to contribute to books or journals, and participate in social events. Part 3. The Handle for Westerners in Beijing. The two most influential Western scholars in Beijing during the May 4th period were Mr. Dewey and Mr. Rousseau. But there are already many monographs and articles talking about their time in China. I want to talk about two other types of Westerners that Hu Shi was in frequent contact with: professor and teaching staff at Peking University and sinologists visited Beijing. When Hu Shi first arrived at Peking University and accepted the position of the head of the Department of English Literature, he found himself in frequent contact with many of the British and American professors who had come to teach English. Of all the foreign professors at Peking University, Hu Shi's most frequent contact was with Bever. He was from Britain. Bever began teaching at PKU in 1911, and his courses include English law, special lectures on English and American law, and so on. Bever earned 450 yuan per month, making him one of the highest earning foreign professors on campus. Clark was recruited by Peking University Department of English Literature in August 1920 and taught courses including modern novels, cultural history of England and America, and so on. Mr. Clark was recruited as a lecturer in Zorc was American teacher. He began teaching at the PKU Department of English Literature in October 1919, where he taught courses on theater and prose. In 1922, one a set of teaching materials called Western Literature, Grace and Brown, Volume 1, he compiled, was to be published by Shanghai Commission Press. He had Hu Shi write the book's preface. Wenla began teaching British history at Peking University in October 1917. Louis Chess came to Peking University in October 1921 and taught prose selections and prose and poetry. Chess also served as a professor at Yanjing University. Barrows der Holstein, he is very famous, as you know, entered the Peking University Department of Philosophy in January 1920, where he taught courses such as the history of religion in ancient India and Sanskrit. Hu Shi provided the interpretation for his course on the history of religion in ancient India. Because Holstein taught at Peking University for many years, Hu Shi kept in contact with him for far longer than both often foreign professors. Perhaps because their studies were alike in many ways. Holstein was one of Hu Shi's most admired, renowned international scholars. During the May 4th period, Hu Shi kept in regular contact with the foreign Western sinologists, our orientalists, Johnston from England, Lessing from Germany, Delavier from Switzerland, Purvier from Russia, Oswald Sierra and Anderson from Sweden. Johnston was a teacher to Puyi, the emperor. He often met with Hu Shi during meeting of the Society of Friends of Literature. Many of Johnston's letters to Hu Shi are preserved in Hu's English archives now. Lessing was a German linguist who taught German and Sanskrit at Peking University. Lessing's name first appears in Hu Shi's diary entry for December 18, 1919, and Lessing remained in Beijing for at least 3 years. 3 of his letters to Hu Shi are kept with Hu Shi's English archives. Oswald Sierra was a famous Swedish sinologist known for his research on Chinese and Uragic art history. In 1922, during his visit to Beijing, Sierra had in-depth discussions with Hu Shi on many occasions about Chinese and Western art. Anderson was a Swedish geologist. During his visit in Beijing, he got in touch with Hu Shi, and Hu Shi thought very highly of him. Conclusion. Given his fame during the May 4th period, most of Western scholars thought it was an honor to meet with Hu Shi. For all his work received those Western scholars who came to visit Beijing, it's not at all out of line to say that Hu Shi acted as a sort of handler for Western scholars in Beijing. It's common knowledge that Hu Shi is viewed as a representative of the new cultural movement. But from this paper, we can see that Hu Shi played an even more important and unique role in facilitated cultural exchange between China and the West during the May 4th period. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ouyang. How do I close this? I don't know. Yeah. תודה. צריך עכשיו של אמירה. Okay. Now we will move to our next speaker, who's Amira Katz-Ger. Amira Katz-Ger is the translator of Chinese literature into Hebrew. And her translations range from classical texts like the Lunyu to modern Chinese authors, including, of course, May 4th authors. Recently, her translation, together with Professor Andrew Platz, of the Honglo-Mang, has been published by the Bialik Publishing House in Jerusalem. Her topic today is how admirable is fiction, how frightening is fiction. May 4th faith in the power of right reading and some past echoes. Mira.
Thank you, Mihi. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good morning. A very sad morning. And as Lee said, May 4th is really, it started for us with Professor Eber and seems to finish somehow. It's today anyway. More important even is that she's the one who gave us the great love for Chinese literature and the great present of our life, in fact. So, May 4th, who knows? I'll start with a short, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll start with a short digression, an anecdote which I've come across when reading a piece on illnesses in the Honglo-Mang, The Dream of the Red Chamber, rather remote from May 4th, but with this conference coming up, it brought to my mind the topic I'm going to talk about. It tells of a young woman being obsessed with reading the novel, empathizing with Lin Dayu, everybody knows, one of the three important characters in the novel, and obviously having fallen in love with Bao Yu, the novel's main character. Now I have to move this thing. As reported by the scholar Le Jun in his book of 1874, she obtained a copy of the Honglo-Mang from her brother's desk and could not stop reading it. She was so enthralled she could not eat or sleep. When coming across a beautiful section, she would shut the book and contemplate it, shedding tears. And then she would start and read it again and again. Before she could finish it, she fell ill. Fearing that the book had caused their daughter's illness, her parents burned it. Thereupon she shouted, "Why did you burn Bao Yu and Dai Yu?" She would both laugh and cry, speaking incoherently, and while sleeping, always called for Bao Yu. Her parents invited the shaman, who employed a variety of treatments, all without effect. Finally, one night, staring at a lamp at the head of her bed, she kept muttering, Bao Yu is here." And weeping in silence, she closed her eyes and died. In short, as her condition worsened, the girl has clearly lost the distinction between fiction, dreams, delusion, and reality. Fiction here takes control of the real world. Or else, one might say she read the novel wrongly. And she, whether a real maiden or not, is not the only one. There are many more stories of sickly and dying readers of the Honglo-Mang, and of course readers of other novels, and prominently the Mudanting, the Peony Pavilion, which was regarded as no lesser a threat than the Honglo-Mang. Otherwise, there are numerous references to the attraction of and obsession with reading in actual literary works. Again, these appear repeatedly and substantially in the Honglo-Mang, where various novels and plays are either selectively permissible or banned altogether, and the connection between illicit reading and illness followed by death, is forcefully established. Lin Daiyu, the obsessive, sensitive reader and writer of poetry, is inflicted with emotional frenzy, frailty, illness, and premature death, not unconnectedly to her artistic temperament. But now back to my title, originating in Liang Qichao's well-known influential essay, The Relationship Between Fiction and the Government of the People. I start my talk here in 1902 with Liang's essay and end it in 1941 with a story by Shen Zongwen. Liang's ideas are considered to be, and partly professed by Liang himself, mainly foreign-inspired. Less attention has been paid to the native origin of his direct, optimistic, almost naive to our ears, faith in the power of fiction. His faith is so forcefully voiced as to appear ingrained and almost as a matter of course. So mighty is fiction that its revival is conceived as a necessary condition for the transformation of people's consciousness and the cure of China's ills. Indeed, it reveals a deep-rooted feeling for fiction, but which in his essay has some inner contradictions. His followers of May 4th, whose thoughts on revolutionizing fiction and poetry are hardly separable from his, did in their own fashion express the same faith, each with their own changing degrees of reservation and inner conflict. So I will focus here on this particular point, Liang's faith, neglecting justifiably or unjustifiably as this may be, much of what has been said about the background of his advocacy of new fiction, that is, the foreign, Western and Japanese literary and political theories, and concomitantly the new circumstances of material culture, mainly the development of means of dissemination of ideas of fiction, newspapers, literary supplements, periodicals, and ever so important, the flood of translations of Western novels. I need some water. Instead of this accepted account of Liang's views, I'll point to the terminology he employs in expounding the power of fiction, but first just to remind ourselves the first lines of his essay. If one intends to renew the people of a nation, one must first renew its fiction. Therefore, to renew morality, one must renew fiction. To renew religion, one must renew fiction. To renew politics, one must renew fiction. And so it goes on and on. And at the end, he asks, why is this so? This is because fiction has unimaginable power over the way of man. Liang's essay begins with man's natural fondness of fiction. Fiction, he writes, has become as indispensable to life as air and food. One could not dispense with it, even if one wanted to. He ascribes this fondness on the one hand to man's discontent with the world, which makes him wish to get outside of one's own self to worlds beyond, and on the other hand to his incapability neither to understand nor to formulate the motives of his feelings and imaginings. Following this, Liang presents the four powers of fiction, upon which its influence on the way of men rests. There are the powers active. These are the powers active in the process of reading. The essay ends with an attack on the depravity of traditional fiction, which he presents indistinctly as what we'd call today a universal brainwash of all Chinese, whether of lowly or elevated class and education. Of all this, I wish to pick out some of the qualities of what he calls the four powers of fiction. These, as well as other relevant terms appearing in the essay, reflect a conviction and fascination with what characterizes various genres of traditional fiction, just the genres he blames for destroying the entire society, Chinese society. At the head of the list stand superstitious beliefs coming from people's fondness for tales of the supernatural, strange, and fantastic, with their ghosts, spirits, foxes, monsters, tales which rely on an easy journey between worlds. Liang readily associates the four powers of fiction both with bad, in quotes, traditional fiction and with the new wished-for good fiction. The description of their effects is both passionate and vague, and not necessarily what one would expect in a discourse on new enlightened, rational political novels. The four terms he uses, Shun, Jin, I'll show it in a minute on the slide, Shun, Jin, Zi, and Ti, indicate in their Buddhist context stages of knowledge, and although Liang believes they can be adequately explained, they cannot explain what happens in the process of reading, his rhetoric reminds one more of what happens to a reader of genres of traditional fiction, which he so vehemently berates later in the essay. The terms have been thoroughly discussed by others, and I'll just quote a few sentences relevant to the point I'm trying to make. The first power is what I mentioned, is called Shun, variably translated as therification, a word that no one knows, I think. It's to do with sensing, with ritually perfuming, with the smell of incense, and other translations, perfuming, smoke screening, diffusing. It is like entering a cloud of smoke and being therified or perfumed by it, or like touching ink or vermilion and being tinted by it. When reading a novel, one's perception, thinking, and sensitivity are unconsciously affected and conditioned. 4b. The second power is Jin, immersion, soaking, permeating. Immersion refers to the process in which a reader is so engrossed in a novel that it causes him to assimilate himself with its contents. When one reads a novel, very often one is unable to free oneself from its effect, even long after having finished reading it. The third power, Zi, is that of stimulation, piercing. Whereas the effects of purification and immersion are gradual, that of stimulation is immediate. And although the effects of purification and immersion take place without the readers being aware of them, that of stimulation is able to suddenly evoke in the reader strange feelings over which he has no control. Before reading The Dream of the Red Chamber, I am happy. But when I read about Qing Wen's leaving the Grandview Garden or Lin Daiyu dying in the bamboo retreat, why do I suddenly shed tears? The fourth power, Ti, is that of lifting, elevating. All readers of novels often feel that they have entered a state of self-transformation and that they themselves have become the principal characters once they are engrossed in them. What transpires here as the essential traits of effective fiction are its compelling force, engulfing the reader unconsciously and uncontrollably, transporting him or her to other realms. The evocation of emotions and the transposition to worlds beyond are, in Liang's words, the essence of all writings and the source of the power of the pen and the tongue. However, these powers of fiction, which he wishes to associate with new vernacular writing, are inseparable from what he calls the poisonous effects of fiction. In any case, I don't really wish to discuss here the contradictional tensions in Liang's essay. I'm only trying to tread a very faint line, inspired by his faith in the power of fiction, seemingly an echo from the past, and possibly an echo to be repeated thereafter. Bad, in quotes, traditional fiction kept Bad, in quotes, traditional fiction kept writers busy, readers excited, and the discussion about it continuing through the next 2 decades after Liang's essay and later. Sequels of traditional novels and classical tales most popularly so tales of the supernatural and strange. Here comes in Pusung Ling with his Liao Zhai Zhi, flooded the book markets. Other than the purely commercial ones, a fair number were written by reformists caught in the midst of old and new, or consciously having it both ways, exploiting the old popular material while at the same time rationalizing and cleansing what was considered deplorable. Later on, needless to say, in the new, ever more radical writings of May 4th, a more rigorous focusing on language, form, and subject matter became a firm commitment, or an obsession in C.T. Hsia's coinage, everybody knows, embraced by so many of the intellectuals and writers. For all that, relics of bad fiction, in quotes, remain amongst others in the inspired, complex, and less didactic stories of Shen Tsung-Wen. Here he comes in. Although excluded from the literary canon of modern Chinese literature up to the early 80s of the last century, Shen became a most influential May 4th writer in the post-Cultural Revolution era, both with the writers identified as truth-seeking in the 80s and 90s and with more recent ones too. Sorry, I missed this one. We are here. I will conclude here with a few notes on Shen's remarkable story, Gazing at Rainbows. I don't know if people know this story. Kan Hung Lu, which contains fiction, autobiography, and deliberations on the essence of writing and reading. The story is an experiment in putting into practice Shen's ideas on writing, while at the same time examining what he writes step by step, questioning its accuracy, immediacy, and integrity. The story ends with the author narrator's surprising statement that he has been writing Qing Feng, a fox fairy tale by Pusung Ling. And I'm quoting, "To my surprise, it is 10 at night again. The moonlight is bright and clear as it floods the veranda. So I open the door to let the moonlight in. It is as if someone has quietly followed the moonlight into my room and standing behind me asked, 'Why do you torment yourself so? What is it for?' My eyes moisten as I force a smile, but I do not turn around. I'm writing about Qing Feng, the character in Strange Tales from a Chinese studio. I want to bring her back with my pen." What might Shen Tsung-Wen have meant by referring in 1941 to his distant predecessor of the 17th, 18th century? The story's ending is clearly not just a random literary association. The whole story can be convincingly read as modeled on the Liao Zhai, perhaps an attempt by the author to join a kindred spirit in the contemplating of what literature is or ought to be. Kan Hung Lu consists of 3 parts. In the first, a short prologue, the author-narrator returns home from what he calls another place. Gradually, he is drawn by memory and imagination into the recollection of an experience. A distinct fragrance of plum blossoms attracts him to a courtyard and a little room. Recollection melts strangely but naturally into reality. He is now the visitor, Curran, wholly lost in a fantastically solitary state, when the mistress of the room, Juren, quietly steals in, her image appearing in the mirror opposite the stove. He gazes at her green silk dress, her beautiful legs clad in fine stockings, her perfect feet. Following an erotic conversation between visitor and mistress of the room, he hands her a story he has written. She reads, he gazes. Writing, reading, and the actual scene of seduction unite in what is the artistic knot of the story. In the final part, the writer, now in his own room, contemplates this experience, the process of writing, and yes, what is hinted in the story's subtitle, which I haven't given you, but it is the shape of one's personal life in 24 hours. The visitor's story, as we read, is a tale of hunting a doe, Tzviya בעברית. Both the frame story and the inner tale of the hunt are stories of search and quest. The word for catching, arresting, holding, zhuozhu, and other synonyms in the story appears several times in the text, both in the physical and symbolic meanings. It is the story of a hunt, a seduction of the desired woman, and her, as seductress, reading her visitor's tale. It is also an attempt to capture the moment and precisely record the experience, its madness, the moment which always seems to escape the author's brush and vanish. The story in modern dress follows what so many tales of Pusung Ling do when crossing boundaries between the supernatural and natural, dream and awareness, the imagined and the real. Moreover, doing so, it might be seen as a dialogical swan song comment. Shen's writing of fiction in the 40s started dwindling. He stopped writing fiction. So a sort of a swan song comment expressing his own stance on the power of fiction within the ongoing disputes on literature and its function. I will conclude with both writers' own words about their own perception of the self and the procedure of writing. First, Pusung Ling's preface to his Liao Jai Jui. I am but the dim flame of the autumn firefly with which goblins jockey for light, a cloud of swirling dust, jeered at by mountain ogres. Though I lack the talent of Ganbao, I too am fond of seeking the spirits. My excitement quickens. This madness is indeed irrepressible, and so I continually give vent to my vast feelings and don't even forbid this folly. Won't I be laughed at by serious men? It's just that here, it is the glimmering hour of midnight as I am about to trim my failing lamp. Outside my bleak studio, the wind is sighing. Inside, my desk is cold as ice. Draining my wine cup and grasping my brush, I complete the book of lonely anguish. How sad it is that I must express myself like this. And Shen's words towards the end of Gazing at Rainbows, 11:30. Yellow light from a rapeseed oil lamp covers my black table and spreads through my tiny room. I feel very tired, yet still I live in a fantastic realm that will go on and on. The end of the lampwick has effloresced. A little blossom has opened up within the flame. My heart also seems to burn and rage. I know not why. It is about 5 minutes before daybreak. I have dispelled all my past and present experiences and abstractions, giving up the power to analyze the meaning of their existence. My head is spinning. I have been driven to the brink of madness again by my quest to preserve these images in my memory, forms that are materially and spiritually perfect. Ultimately, the I dissolves into the story. I've already written 5,000 words in the composition book that lies on my desk, on my table. And the really last note, as for the right reading mentioned in my title and somewhat neglected here, Shen, the visitor narrator, requires of the woman to read his story slowly, as does Feng Zhenluan, an important commentator on the Liao Jai, advising the reader to read at a slow pace so as to get beneath the tale's surface. More directly, he adds, read these tales properly and they will make you strong and brave. Read them in the wrong way and they will possess you. Cling to the details and they will possess you. Grasp the spirit and you will be strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amira. Was inspiring as usual. And now, before we go on to our next speaker, I'd like to invite the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Michael Siegel, to greet us, as I promised before.
Okay, I can still say good morning because we're not at 12 o'clock yet. I'm sorry I was not able to be here at 10:30 for the opening. I'm running from event to event today, but it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University for this impressive symposium marking the centennial of the events of May 14th, 1919. Asian studies in general and the study of China in particular is, I'm very happy to say, one of the strengths of our faculty, both in terms of the researchers that we have on our staff, the faculty we have on our staff, and the one of our largest student bodies in terms of undergraduates studying here. And I think it's really a testament to the efforts of the faculty that we have here that the program has been so successful. It's an honor that we have so many scholars coming from around the world for this conference. And I would like to say more about the events of May 4th, 1919, but I actually am a scholar of antiquity of Judaism. So I don't have that much more to say, so I will refrain from trying to say something insightful about the topic of the conference, and just wish you the best of luck and an enjoyable rest of the day here at the Hebrew University. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Siegel, and we appreciate very much that you've come here, although you're very, very busy. Okay, now our last speaker in this session is Professor Mark Gamza from Tel Aviv University. Professor Gamza, who combines the field of Chinese history and literature, and who's a graduate of this university, I might say, has written extensively on Sino-Russian cultural literary exchanges and on many other topics. His topics today is May 4th's quest for the Chinese X and their legacy. And I might say that I asked Mark, what is the X? I don't know what Chinese X is. He told me to wait and hear today. So please, Mark.
I should really start by presenting myself as a student of Professor Eber, and it was thanks to her that I started reading later on May 4th, and especially translation during May 4th. And actually the last time I was here in Jerusalem was for a celebration for Professor Eber's last book on Jewish refugees in Shanghai. Just last month, was it? Yeah. Most recently, actually, I've read her memoir, The Choice, which is a wonderful book. So, where is the Chinese X? Let's start from the 1910s to the 1920s with the search for cultural role models. When the poet Su Junmo left Peking to study in the United States, he said that he would like to become the Alexander Hamilton of China, a founding father of the United States. Then he went to Cambridge afterwards, and coming back to Beijing in 22, he said this in a speech in English to Chinese students at Tsinghua. Isn't it striking that we look in vain in the scroll of our famous literary figures for even the least resemblance of a Goethe, a Shelley, a Wordsworth, not to say a Dante and a Shakespeare? And as for the other arts, who is there to rank with the vast genius of men like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Turner, Correggio, Velázquez, Wagner, Beethoven, to name but a few. This was very typical for May 4th. There are many more examples that I could give you, just two of them here. In an article of 1921, a reformer of Chinese theater is saying, "Where is the Chinese George Sidney?" If you don't know who he is, he was a Jewish American clown. And actually, there was a Chinese or an Oriental Charlie Chaplin, and that was Su Zhoudai. Now, who is the Chinese Lord Byron? There were several candidates, but he was mostly identified with the Chinese poet who translated him, Su Manchu. And there were other candidates. Emily Han was an American adventurer, you might say, who came to Shanghai in the 1930s. And here are two quotations from memoirs of hers. Especially on the translators. The authors they've chosen to work on have a definite effect upon their personalities. I know, in fact, quite a great many of these people. There's a Chinese Chesterton, a Gilbert Seldes, who was an American journalist, a Northcliffe, a Quiller Couch, and a Faulkner. China is simply stuffed with Henry Jameses. I skip the next part of the sentence. About Mr. Shakespeare, though, he doesn't look like the original. That is, I'm almost sure he doesn't, because she met him, actually. She married a Chinese poet, Shao Xunmei, some of whose admirers called him the Chinese Verlaine. Emily Han asked him if he would accept the title of the Chinese Cocteau. According to Han, Shao replied that as a poet he had been something like Swinburne, but not a Cocteau. Well, who are you then? She asked him again. The Chinese Northcliffe, he said solemnly. That's a British publisher of popular fiction and newspapers. And that's him. Then in the 1930s to the 1950s, we have more political role models being looked for. In the nationalist camp, some were saying, where is the Chinese Mussolini? The Chinese Communist Party looked for and found Chinese Stakhanovs after the Soviet model worker. Here are two of them mentioned here, and there were, of course, campaigns launched in order to emulate these persons, just like in the Stakhanovite movement in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. Then the Chinese Communist Party also acted to locate or create the Chinese equivalents of Soviet heroes, whether real ones, like the Chinese Pavliks, named after the child hero, the first pioneer of the Soviet Union, Pavlik Morozov, who denounced his father to the KGB. Or fictional Soviet paragons, Chinese Levinsons, who was a hero of a book called The Rout. Chinese Korchagins, from a very famous novel. Then by the 1960s, there's the break in the relations with the Soviet Union, and Russian heroes turn into villains. Liu Shaoqi becomes the Chinese Khrushchev. If I had a mouse, I could. No, that's a shame. How do I press the link? A link to go to the internet. Do you know how to do it? Okay. Oh, thank you very much. A mouse is very useful in such cases. Yeah. So it doesn't work. There's no connection. Okay. So now, what is happening now? Already in the 1940s, Laoshi writes about the Chinese Dante. Who will be the Chinese Dante? We need the Chinese Dante. Actually, he wanted to be, suddenly it appears, he had an aspiration to become China's Dante himself. Okay, we might eventually, with the passage of time, see Chinese Khrushchev. It's a dramatic moment. Here it is. you can see him. I mean, you can't really see him because there's very little hidden over there, but you're supposed to attack him. That's Cultural Revolution poster. The Chinese Khrushchev. Okay. Yes. So, but Dante, of course, is a symbol. Italy has Dante Alighieri institutes, like Germany has Goethe institutes, Spain Cervantes institutes, and China has found its own Dante in the Confucius institutes. But of course, searching for the Chinese Dante is not the real thing, because Italian is not the most important language of international communications. English is. And so what we really have to find is the Chinese Shakespeare. So who is the Chinese Shakespeare? One candidate was Cao Yu. But nowadays, you might have heard of the fact that the Chinese Shakespeare is the Ming playwright Tang Xianzu. President Xi Jinping himself called him the Chinese, the Eastern Shakespeare on a state visit in Britain in 2015. And in the following year, thanks to the coincidence that Tang Xianzu died in the same year as Shakespeare. Now, previously it was noted that Cervantes died in the same year, but that made 2016 too much of a European year. And now this imbalance has been corrected, and therefore 2016 is a Chinese year as well, which is very important. Therefore, not only do we have the Chinese Shakespeare, but we have the Chinese Stratford-upon-Avon, which is the little town of Fuzhou in Jiangxi. They're building a replica of Shakespeare's house. They're building a whole town to honor the three elders, as they call them, Tang, Cervantes, and Shakespeare, all those people who died in the same year. Now, I need to press another link here. Meanwhile, I'll say that one does wonder why in 2016 or 19, China needs the authority of Shakespeare in order to honor a playwright of the Ming Dynasty. But then if you think of the American dream and the Chinese dream, you see a connection there too. Isn't the term the Chinese dream actually supposed to provide a Chinese answer to an American idea? Here, if I can enlarge this, you will see the report on the replica. You will see some interesting photos too, but it takes time. Okay. Here they are. Just another photo. Here they signed the agreement. But more interestingly, here you will see the house. It has passed. Okay, I think, yeah, since this doesn't work very well, I'll skip it and I'll go to my analysis of this whole business. Now, I actually wrote about some such things in my my second book on Russian literature in China, and there I discuss it in terms of cultural humility. Now, this is entirely wrong, because cultural humility is the opposite, I think, is that sort of security in your own culture when you can relativize it, so to speak. You can give a respect to another culture while being secure in yours. Here we have a sense of inferiority, which is more like an Australian term, actually, cultural cringe. Then there's the business of name dropping, which is endemic in May 4th. When we speak about the May 4th period. Now, in linguistic terms, this figure of speech that we are speaking about is called metonymy. And I will give you some examples of it. Like the White House has declared, yes? This is a metonymy, yes? but actually, there is a rhetorical trope which I think is more fitting, and this is called antonomasia, especially a variant of it called Phocian antonomasia, which we'll look at now for a moment. Oops, I couldn't resist and had to show you Mr. Phocius, who was a very clever man, and he thought up this Phocian antonomasia. Now, for example, let's say we substitute a phrase by proper name, yes? So if I say the bard, I mean Shakespeare. If I say the king of pop, I mean Michael Jackson. If I say the Israeli Trump, I mean, no, this is Jack. But it is used often for places, like I can say the eternal city, meaning Rome, yes? The construction here is like to say Suzhou is the Chinese Venice, right? Or to say Lucian is the Chinese Chekhov, or Gorky, or Nietzsche has been compared to all these people constantly. This is clearly a Eurocentric perspective, but it is a perspective adopted and actively used by the Chinese themselves. Now, this is an example, of course, of a very famous text which has its own special characteristics. This is a C.T. Xia writing in 1967. I won't read it to you, you can read it yourself, and we go on. Just now, a translator of Lu Xun lapses into the same style, starting by, it's hard to find a precise Western analog for Lu Xun. I wonder for whom can one find a precise analog. He is China's Dickens, he is Joyce, he is Orwell, and he has a touch of Gorky. Now, this continues. I conclude by some uses of the same method in the marketing of contemporary Chinese literature. Who is the Chinese Chekhov? Here are some examples. The Chinese Kundera, there are two at least. And we have the Chinese Borges and the Chinese Marquez, and the list goes on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now, if you, I think we have time for questions, answer, discussion. So please, we'll add two chairs here, and please, Professor Kubin, Amira, Mark, and Professor Ouyang, let's put some work here. We can one more. And can how do we? I think I'd like to ask what Professor Vera Schwartz has. Please.
I have some comments and questions for each of the speakers.
Would you like to come over? Maybe it will be easier because they take.
Because I can't speak anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
Excuse me. I will start with Professor Ouyang's remarks on Husserl. And because it's the 100th anniversary, to remind all of us how unusual it is to have a scholar from Beijing speak about the details of Husserl's contact with Westerners. This is a subject that was forbidden 20 years ago. And I would like Professor Ouyang to tell us a little bit about, because I remember him being one of the very first to daringly open up the question of Husserl when it wasn't fangbian, it wasn't kosher to talk about Husserl. It was Lu Xun, Chen Duxiu, Li Dazhao. And so we have here a scholar from the mainland that was involved for the last 25 years in expanding the frame of who can be talked about in one term. So that's for Professor Ouyang. For Amira and Professor Kubin, I want to ask the question about not only Lu Xun or the ways of reading, but really we're dancing around the question of Baihua. I think after 100 years, we can reconsider, was it a good thing? And what's the relationship between Baihua and the closing of the Chinese mind? Lu Xun was Bu Bai Bu Wen. He danced between classical and modern with great difficulty. But I think if we talk about the closing of the Chinese mind in the 21st century, it might have to do with the so-called language revolution of May 4th. And finally, I think Mark's question about the analogies, the quest for cultural analogs. I think when was it Zhang Xianglan who got the Nobel Prize? I'm trying to remember. Who got the Chinese Nobel Prize right after 89? No, Gao Shima. No, the first.
But he won as a French citizen.
That's right. So, I think looking at the two different Nobel Prizes, and then I will be speaking about Liu Xiaobo. I think it's a question that we need to ask about who has been honored, not as the Shakespeare, but who has won the admiration of the West and on what grounds. And the last thought about the quote that Mark showed about Tixi Xia. I think as we talk about the writer who drenched pushed China's, the cultural cringe, the shortcomings of the Chinese national character, it's worth remembering Japan and the idealization of racial characters. So I think one of the things that we remember about the May 4th writers is that they dared to confront the shortcomings of Chinese national character, which was a difficult thing to do in the 20th century.
Thank you. So please, Professor Ouyang, you can either speak from here or there.
Yeah. I think the topic when we talk about new culture movement, our May 4th movement, usually we can remember Hu Shi, Tsai Ying-pei, Lu Xun. I think most of yours perhaps think Lu Xun is the most important, like Gu Bin. So Gu Bin, his paper talk about Lu Xun. The other professor, I believe the papers discuss about Lu Xun. But my paper, focus on Hu Shi.
When was the first time you began to do research on Hu Shi?
On Hu Shi. Hu Shi, I think, is very important in that very important between the Western and China cultural exchange. He's more important than the others. As he studied in the U.S., he was very familiar to the American culture. So I think he was the number one to introduce American culture in China. Lu Xun studied in Japan, so he was familiar to Japanese culture. But Japanese, I think, was the second class modern country. Japan studied Western modernization, Western modern. Japan was the second-hand modernization country. There is no liberalism in China, intellectuals to study in Japan, but most intellectuals studied in Japan. They just get skills
methods, but no liberalism. 就是没有自由主义在日本的留学生中间。Just study in US or in England, study in England. Some of them are liberalism, like 胡适严复，但是鲁迅不是自由主义者，他可以是一个革命者。Yeah, okay.
My question was about 中国胡学的这个发展，78、79年在中国大陆上这个
胡适
学的什么时候开始发展？所以就因为别人有。
After 1918 years, 胡适 the study of 胡适developed very fast, I think. Yeah, very fast. After 1980 years. Now it became a 显学 in Chinese. Very popular now.
Thank you, Professor Yang. Professor Kubin and Mira. Okay. Sorry. I just would like to address Amira, Professor Kubin, Mark, to answer Professor Schwartz's question. Please.
You start.
I don't know what the question exactly was about Baihua.
It's about
And I was talking
about
about
language,
pardon?
the language revolution.
Yeah. Okay, it's a big subject. And in fact, I was talking about Pu Sung-ling. I didn't mention, of course, everybody knows that these are tales written in the classical Chinese. So it's, but I chose that particularly because there is something in these tales which has in it sort of the, might be, I don't know how to say it, the epitome or really the essence of writing, the thing of the fiction and non-fiction. And this is, I think, the thing which is connecting, in a way, the Liang Qichao and Shen Songwen and Pu Sung-ling in a very vague way, but it's sort of associative. Might be it's only my associations, but it's anyway. Might be Professor Kubin wants to say something about the Baihua Revolution.
Well, if we speak about Baihua, we have to speak about form and content as well. Lu Xun did not only invent Baihua, of course he was not the first, but he was perhaps the most successful. He also invented new forms. He invented what we might call the short story. He invented prose poem. He was not able to invent modern poetry. He wrote ancient poetry. But the most important thing perhaps is that under the influence, for instance, under the influence of Nietzsche, that he was able to create a new content, not only for China, but also for us. I only recently came across Canetti, who was probably a Jew, who wrote in German and lived in London, is buried in Switzerland. I came recently across the idea that modernity is only to be understood through the connection between the masses and the power. And for me, astonishing was when I prepared this paper for Vienna, that Lu Xun had a feeling for this problem. He wrote as a narrator about it. I'm not sure if he has a theory, but Canetti has. And so we can bring them together. And the idea of the masses might be also a topic of Nietzsche. Perhaps so we have to see Baihua in the content of new forms and new contents. I think the Baihua would not have been possible without new forms and contents.
may I add one remark as to my final explanations there. What does the linguistic analysis or the rhetorical analysis add to all these examples? It shows us that whether you consider this as a metonymy or as an antonomasia in the terms of rhetoric, in any case, one side of the comparison is considered as the ideal paragon, and the other side is always the inferior one, which seeks to become as good as the Western component. This is why it is so problematic, you see, and this is why it reflects a certain inferiority complex, in my view.
Thank you very much. Yes, so Sheila, Dr. Sheila, please.
I have one question for Professor Kubin. So, to some extent, you're identifying two Lushan.
More than two.
But
Mainly.
Would you like to come over because it is recorded, so it's important that you will be here.
I just wait for your question.
in the you're talking about. I'm talking from the political standpoint. You're talking of the Lushun who wrote in the May 4th movement and after the New Cultural Movement and after, and then to some extent there's this Lushun that was artificially elated by the communist regime and which has disappeared since the 1980s. And there is another writer which also was to some extent put on par with Lushun, although I do not think that is as important, and is also less important today. It's Guo Moro. And before the Cultural Revolution, it was difficult not to speak of Lushun without speaking of Guo Moro. They were considered, to some extent, the two representative of modern literature artificially. And so what can you say in this, for instance, because you had a philosophical reading, which is to some extent detached from today from Lushun, but this to some extent this political character or was a construction that was given to both Lushun and Guo Moro, and that is to some extent not kosher anymore. Thank you.
Well, with the criticism of Lushun, what China presents us are different persons of Lushun whom he might have been. He is criticized for moral reasons and so on and so on. Lushun was a construction till the end of the Cultural Revolution, and his picture changed very much. Guo Moro, though he's very problematic, but he's one of the most interesting, not only Chinese writers or thinkers or politicians. I have dealt with him very much, and still I acknowledge that he has good poetry, some good poetry, and an excellent autobiography. And if we want to understand the 20th century, we have to deal with him for any reason. Well, the Lushun that I was taught during Cultural Revolution in Beijing was a hero. And now I discover that he is for the Chinese people or readers or politicians, not a reader anymore, and getting criticized. But what they are criticizing is more or less his person or certain ideas. The Chinese literary critics, they do not make a difference between the real person who can betray you and the real author who can betray you too. But there must be an implicit author who cannot betray the reader. And there's an implicit narrator, and so on and so on. So we have to read any kind of literature from different angles. But how do we do this? Well, my background is philosophy and theology. I studied both, and then I studied sinology. And I have to teach contemporary German philosophy in China all the time. So I'm now interested in the question of how do we understand? how do we understand understanding? So this is my starting point, but I only came recently across this problem. So this is, I do not want to repeat myself all the time. I wrote about Lu Xun so much, and I need a new start. And I see this in contemporary French and German philosophy. Interpretations are not a result, they're a process. So let's wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. More questions, please. Yes, Professor Edward.
So got a question for Professor Gamza, because as an Australian New Zealander, this issue of cultural prejudice is really a pressing one in Australia. And I was really quite convinced by your argument that it is about an inferiority complex. And I wondered if you would say something about it in relation to the rise of the nation state. Why did this appear, in this May 4th era, and then continue now? Is it something to do with, a social Darwinism, a ranking of nations that suddenly China's intellectuals become really acutely aware of? And how does it connect to things like earlier traditions of comparisons, like when they would say things like, oh, Yunmei from the south and Jiyun from the north? It seemed to be more geographic rather than hierarchical, whereas the way you mapped it out pretty clearly, it really is a hierarchy that they're creating. Is it the same pattern, just spaced? Is it the same pattern of comparison, a desire to give context across geography compared to across a ranking? Not a very clear question.
Yeah, sure. Would you like to come here? Or?
I think one important point is that really in May 4th, they are more looking for those candidates, and nowadays they found them, you see. And this is really important and has to do with the points that you're making about the power of the state and the national sense of inferiority, which adds to the cultural one. And indeed, the May 4th is a package of these two senses of inferiority towards the West, both in terms of nation-state building and the humiliation in Versailles, and then the cultural sort of state of underdevelopment that people like Husch certainly thought in such terms. Then it certainly has to do with these hierarchies and with these political questions as well, and certainly nowadays they are very closely connected with China's current standing in the world and its aspirations to lead, Then the other point that you made, this is a new idea to me, about the Chinese tradition of comparing people, like you say, A from the south or B from the north. So this is interesting. I didn't think of that. I should look into it.
Thank you very much.